Thank you, everyone, for coming. Let me tell you a bit about the format I had in mind tonight. So I wrote this book. It came out today. I was going to tell you a bit about it and a bit about myself. Not too long, maybe like 20 minutes. And then open it up to QA about anything related to what I talk about or about my startup, which is DuckDuckGo. And if there's discussion, there can be discussion. And then the Ice Center, who is nice enough to host this, ordered pizza for us. Thank you. And there'll be, after we talk, there'll be pizza and drinks outside, and people can mill about and talk to each other. And that's about it. So I have pictures. They're not really slides. They're just pictures to guide what I was going to talk about. And I haven't really used the iPad presenting before, so bear with me if it breaks. Does anyone know who this is? Just out of curiosity. The AngelList dude, yes. Naval Ravikant. So just by show of hands, how many people in the audience have done a startup or are doing a startup or have kind of done it? Nice. And the rest, are you, I'm assuming, want to do a startup or are Villanova students? Cool. Okay, so that means some people don't know some of this inside baseball startup lingo, so I will educate you a little bit on that too. So this guy started this company called AngelList, where more and more startups are getting funding for their startups. And he really has the inside track into what traction, which is what the book is about, real customer growth for your startup, how much traction it takes to raise money. And that turns out to be the center of what a lot of people want to do with traction at the beginning because they need money to fund their startup. So in going through the book, we interviewed lots of successful startup founders and other people in the ecosystem. And Naval had like a traditional book kind of thing. I'm going to do some reading from the book, very, very slight reading. But he had a great definition of what traction is. And so his definition was, traction is basically quantitative evidence of customer demand. So if you're an enterprise software, initial traction may be 2 or 3 early customers who are paying a bit. If you're in consumer software, the bar might be as high as hundreds of thousands of users. It's the Supreme Court definition of porn. You'll know it when you see it. And by that he means, traction is a moving target and it depends on your startup, how much you need to get funding and how much you need to really take off. The other quote I have that I want to talk about before I move on there is, who knows who Paul Graham is? Okay, so he founded Y Combinator, kind of the biggest startup accelerator. And he kind of defines traction as growth. A startup company is designed to grow fast. Being newly founded does not itself make a company a startup, nor is it necessary for a startup to work on technology or take venture funding or have some sort of exit. The only essential thing is growth. Everything else we associate from startups follows from growth. And that's really the starting point for our book, which is traction is growth, and the pursuit of traction is what defines a startup. And this number, 19, is for doing all our interviews, we found that there were 19 different ways, after interviewing all these different startups, that startups were getting traction. And some of them are familiar to you, like search engine marketing, ads on Google, or something like that, or SEO. But others are less familiar, like hosting offline events like this. And there ended up being 19 of these. And what we found, so the reason I started this book is a few years ago, I was starting DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine, and I was struggling to get traction myself. At the same point, I was also starting to angel invest, and I found all the companies I angel invest were struggling with traction. Over the past 10 years, it's become easier and easier to start a startup and make a product. So almost every failed startup ends up with a product. What they end up not having is enough customers. And so this illustrates what people usually do when they go try to find customers. they're looking to hit a bullseye, but they're just blindly shooting. And so the path that I've seen again and again is companies build a product. They actually do a good job of building a product. So like say they're following lean startup methodologies, they're doing customer development. Who's heard of lean startup? Okay, so that'll help you get a product that some customers actually want, right? And so what I found was you get to launch day and you actually have a product you want, but they don't know how to get more of those customers who like that product. So then they go out to try to raise money, but they can't raise money, back to Naval, what he said about traction, because they don't have enough traction. And so they flounder and essentially die. And the saddest part about that is their product was actually good. Like they validated it, they had beta customers and feedback, but they couldn't translate that into actual customers. And so our answer to that is the bullseye framework. Ugh. The problem with this is I made a progression and I didn't memorize it because I've never given this before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ditch this and just talk. So what ends up happening is startups launch and then they try like a few things, right? So they try a blog post or two, they launch on Hacker News or some Google AdWords. They just basically do stuff in random. They're doing a random walk. But what they should have done is more systematically figured out which of the 19 channels is the one that will make them take off, and then focus on that. And so the framework we lay out in the book called Bullseye is designed to help you, figure out the right marketing channel that'll get you to take off. And the whole thing is not very complicated. It sounds kind of ridiculously simple when you lay it out. The framework is this. You start with brainstorming all the different 19 channels as it might apply to your startup. So you literally go through each one and you try to assess, how I could use this marketing channel effectively in my startup. Now, this is doing two things. The first is it is counteracting your bias. So when I started DuckDuckGo, my previous startup, I had gotten a lot of traction via SEO, search engine optimization, which is getting people to click on your search results in Google. So the first thing I did when trying to start DuckDuckGo was get traction through SEO. That was a dumb move. It was not a lot of users. I was trying to rank for a new search engine. How many people are searching new search engine on Google? Turns out some, but not a ton. And what I really should have done is done this brainstorming step and said, which of these channels would actually move the needle for my business? And that's what the brainstorming step is supposed to do. It's supposed to force you to overcome your bias. So that's a positive bias I had towards SEO. Like other word for that is availability bias. It was available in my head. You also have negative biases towards things. Like a lot of startup founders are product guys or girls who like to sit and code in their computer science lab, and they don't like to get out of the building, as the lean startup people say. And so they discount sales, affiliate marketing, speaking engagements. But those actually might be the thing that makes your startup take off. So that's the first step. The second step is, or the second premise for that, the reason why that is, and for the second step is, you don't know at any given time a priori which channel is going to be the best for your business. And it can actually be unpredictable. And the reason it is unpredictable is you often enter into a market. So, I entered into search engines. The channels that the other people in your market are using to get traction are, if the market's at all developed, are pretty saturated by definition. So a lot of people, what they do is they look at who's been successful, which is a good thing to do to start with, and say, I'm going to replicate that. The problem with that is a lot of those, especially if they're big companies in your market, those channels are bid up. So in my case, in search engines, people generally got users through being installed in the browser, right? Like you're in Internet Explorer or Chrome or Firefox or whatever. As a startup, those deals, those are billion-dollar deals. We're never going to be able to pay for that. then, companies like Ask.com, they use like toolbar downloads. They're paying, like $3 a user through that. That was way too expensive for us too. We're not even monetizing. So what I'm saying is it is unpredictable what's going to work, because generally what's going to work is an underutilized channel that your competitors aren't using. And because it's not being used, you don't necessarily know which one is going to work, because no one's using it successfully. So starting with those two theses, you do this brainstorming step, and you try to assess, okay, what are the most promising ideas? Then you take the most promising ideas and you rank them and prioritize them. And it's generally the case that through the brainstorming step, there are a few ideas that seem pretty promising, like more promising than the rest. There's an obvious drop-off between the top and the ones below. And a side note, when you brainstorm, you should, generally you have a co-founder, but I actually didn't start in DuckDuckGo. You should always brainstorm with somebody else. There's tons of research that shows people are pretty sucky at brainstorming by themselves. So just a tip. So once you rank and prioritize, you have three ideas that seem, three channels that seem like they're going to be good. So it might be PR, speaking engagements, and trade shows. So what you're going to want to do next is test. And this is kind of the third mistake startups make, is they just go all in on a channel right away. I'm going to spend $20,000 and bet everything I have on a trade show. That is not a good idea, because you don't know which is going to work. So you want to find a way to cheaply test these marketing channels. And by cheap, I mean like, a few $1,000s tops. You can run significant tests on some of these advertising platforms for $250. Like on Facebook, you might run 4 ads instead of 40. And what you're trying to do here is get a sense of how much it costs to acquire a customer. Are these customers the right customers? And what messaging is kind of working? And you run these tests in parallel. The other reason to run 3 tests and not do them in serial is because generally you can run a few tests at a time, because they have to run once you set them up. And you want to get to traction as quickly as possible. So you run them in one after the other, you're just basically wasting time. But if you do too many things, you get distracted. So about 3 tests. Hopefully one of those works, is really promising, in which case you double down on it. And by doubling down, that's what we call the focusing step. You kind of hit the bullseye. And the key learning there is, a lot of startups, say they're going to focus on SEO, and they kind of half-ass it. They don't become a world-class expert at SEO. If you pick a channel that you are focusing on to get traction, you should be the expert. And in fact, the startup founders are the experts in those channels, not the, quote, experts, because they're the ones on the cutting edge trying to uncover the tactics that are like the next generation tactics. There's a quote law that Andrew Chen coined that we reference in the book called the law of shitty click-throughs. And what this refers to is that any marketing channel eventually becomes saturated and is shitty, and you end up getting terrible click-throughs. What we were referencing before, if you start on one that's already saturated and very competitive, it almost already has shitty click-throughs. But if you go in a marketing channel that's kind of underutilized, you often can get really high conversions. As an example, I used Reddit ads for DuckDuckGo right when they first came out. And we were one of the first advertisers. And Redditors hadn't seen ads before, and they clicked on them. And we got a lot of users through that. So anyway, let's suppose that it works. You get, let's suppose it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it's pretty simple. You circle back. You use the data that you had from the first 3 tests. You go to the next set of ones on your big list of prioritization. Maybe you reorder them a bit based on your learnings, and you run some more tests. I guarantee you that you won't have to run through all 19 channels to get traction. Either you're going to get traction, or your product is not really fit for the market, and you need better product development cycle. So if you do get traction and it's starting to take off, because of this law of shitty click-throughs, eventually it's going to saturate. And there's two reasons for that. One, either this law that became saturated, or your volume of that channel, you grew successfully. You were so successful that it no longer moves the needle for you. And that's happened with DuckDuckGo a bunch. So when we started out, the first few months we had 10,000 searches a month. Now we're at 150 million, which is many orders of magnitude difference. And almost every order of magnitude there, every 10 times growth, the marketing channel we were using topped out, and we could no longer use it to get growth again. So by way of an example, I think we've been through about 6 different channels. So we started out in SEO, like I mentioned. That didn't take us very far. Then Reddit ads, which I mentioned. Then we did content marketing. We did a bunch of my blog and a bunch of microsites. Then we did print PR, focused on that. Then this past year, we focused on TV, mainstream TV PR. And then now we're focused on business development, doing deals with browsers, those same deals that I mentioned earlier that we could never get into 6 years ago when we first started the business. We're now starting to be able to get into them. And each of those periods, we reached a point where there were diminishing returns on the marketing channel, and we had to literally redo the process I just told you about. We've done it internally in the company many times, and find a new channel where we did tests and we settled on these. So that is in essence the framework for getting traction in the book. So the book itself, the first 5 chapters basically tells you what I just told you, plus a bunch of other traction strategies and tactics. And then the last 19 chapters have a chapter on each channel of the best practices of how to use it. So how to get started at trade shows or search engine marketing or engineering as marketing. And so let's see. A few other things I want to tell you. Some underutilized channels. Okay, what do those look like? So there's one I just named called engineering as marketing, which we named because no one else had a name for it. And so what this is, and I'm using this as an illustration of a channel that hardly anyone's using still today that's probably good for many, many startups. HubSpot, who's familiar with HubSpot? They just filed for an IPO. They grew, a lot of their growth, and I have a quote from the book that I'm not going to find because it's going to take too long, but he says that a lot of their growth still is from this channel, which is they have a site. They're an inbound marketing enterprise company, so they help you get customers and traction the same way I'm talking about. And they got traction from a sister site that they made called Website Grader. I think it might be called Marketing Grader now, where you just go to the site, type in your domain name, and then they run some analysis on it, and they tell you how good you are at inbound marketing. That simple standalone site, they used a little engineering resources. In fact, the founder himself, Dharmesh Shah, who we talked to, coded that site up himself in the early days out of necessity because he was doing this to qualify sales at HubSpot. Put it out on the internet, immediately successful. And millions of people have come through that site just to check out how they were doing at their own domain name. But then every one of those people are now potential customers for HubSpot. And they have data of how well they're doing at inbound marketing, and they have some level of interest shown in HubSpot's product, and they kind of call that and get sales that way. Other example from that particular channel is from Philly, RJ Metrics. How many people have heard of RJ Metrics? Just interested in all these polls. They have a bunch of similar sites. I'm forgetting their names. They're like SQL query database.com or something to help. They're basically tools to help people learn data analysis. And then if they're interested in that, and they're very useful tools, they're good candidates to buy RJ Metrics. All right, and now a little bit about myself to give you some background, which I probably should have started with earlier. I went to MIT, went into startups right out of school. My first company was an educational software company, was wholly unsuccessful. Made lots of rookie mistakes there. Then I did a bunch of different projects. One of them took off. It was an early social network. I sold that to classmates.com in 2006. It was about a similar site to classmates.com, which is a complete anachronism now. You don't need to find your old friends and classmates anymore. Although it was mainly international, so maybe they needed to do more so. And then all that was in Boston, moved to Philadelphia in 2006, started DuckDuckGo the following year, and started angel investing in 2009. I've invested in about 13 different companies. So kind of a wide swath of the ecosystem. My co-author on this book is Justin Mares. He is actually recently out of school. He also started right out of school. And this is career advice that I gave him and he took, and he did well at it. If you want to start a startup, you should realize that startups generally don't get sold like the ones you hear about in 18 months and 24 months. It usually takes 7 to 10 years on average to get to an exit point. How long did Boomi take? 10 years. 10 years, okay. And so I've met a lot of startups, including ones I've angel invested, that go 4 years into it, and they're like, why the F did I choose this product? Now I'm deep into it and I can't get out of it, and you know, I'm basically stuck and I hate my life. So that means either pick something that you're passionate about and start that. If you don't have that, join a startup that is taking off. And the taking off part is important, you know, or someone who has been there, done that, you know, kind of like Rich with Guru. And because most startups fail, like the vast majority, and it's mainly because people like me right out of school start startups, they don't know what they're doing, and they make a lot of mistakes or they fail to get traction. And as a result, you start the startup, it fails, and you think you'd learn a lot from the failure, and you do learn from failures. I failed a ton, but as an employee of the startup, you don't learn that much. You learn how to mess things up, but you don't really learn. There's so many ways to mess things up that you don't really learn how to do it right. So if you go to a startup that is taking off, you actually learn a lot about how to do startups successfully. And there's a sweet spot in there, like right after they've raised some significant money, where there's like 10 people, where you can slot into a position and really make an impact and really put in, like, you know, a lot of the risks have been taken out already, really put in like 4 years, and then turn around, figure out what your idea is going to be, and then start it after that. And so Justin did something very similar. He joined this this startup, became the director of growth, you know, applied basically the tactics here. It was already several years in. It sold to Rackspace last year, and now he's going to start a startup. I just recommend that as a path to anyone who's interested. Okay, with that, I'm going to open it up to QA/discussion.